Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Progressive Christians podcast. We are the love your neighbor kind of Christians and not the storm the Capitol kind. So if you're curious about what a socially and politically progressive Christianity looks like, then this is the podcast for you. My name is Reverend Dr. Christopher Carter, and I'm your host. And I'm also the lead pastor of the Loft Faith Community in Westwood, California. In today's episode, we will be discussing the vice presidential debate and having a lengthy conversation about immigration, which was a particularly hot topic during that debate as well. Today, I am joined by all of us, actually. We got to pick out of a nickname.
Hooray.
I was like, I don't even know. Something to do with four people. Quad is all I can think of, but I got nothing. But I'm joined by Julia, Wesley, and Reverend Blair Trickstad. So everybody's back.
Hello.
Julia's been calling us the pod. Does that work?
Just the pod? Yeah, okay. I guess that works.
The pod for the pod.
The pod for the pod. Exactly. The
Keys
pod
in a
for
pod.
the pod.
4 of them.
I was fascinated by this debate in terms of the fact that it felt kind of like a regular. I haven't experienced a regular debate since before Trump. Yeah, I was like, oh wow, they're actually
two white men on
talking
stage
talking about policy,
pretending to vaguely respect each other, even though they actually hate each other. Yeah, it was giving 90s.
Right.
It was giving my childhood,
Nostalgia.
Yes, nostalgic. Remember when things were just regular awful instead of like super extra awful?
Yeah, let's return to that.
Let's go back to the good old days. Good old days of moderate awful.
Instead of unprecedented awful. Increasingly.
Just take me back to precedented times.
Instead of episodes of Veep awful. And
oh man, yeah, that'd be great. I would love that. A couple of things we want to get at. I guess before I start talking about the number of lies JD Vance shared, I'm curious just if there anything that came up for y'all that y'all want to share in terms of just the way you experienced the debate, something that was said. Yeah, just anything that came up for you.
But Dr. Carter, you promised you weren't going to fact check them.
Oh,
the highlight of the night.
That's the
highlight of the night.
He said it out loud.
Yeah. No awareness of what he's saying into the mic. Or actually a lot of awareness. I think the most frustrating part, I watched the whole debate. It felt a little slow just because, it did. I think Tim Walz started a little slow, but he got comfortable near the end. Had some really good sort of talking points and responses to what JD was talking about. But I think the thing that frustrated me the most was this lack of fact checking. It's like, here's this one time where there is an arbiter that isn't present at a speech or a rally who has a responsibility to let the American people know what is real and what's not real. And the fact that they would agree to not fact check as just something for this debate was incredibly infuriating. The ease with which JD was lying left and right was so frustrating. And the fact that, I can understand that Tim Walz has some responsibility to fact check him. But at that point, because you've got people who see the political landscape so polarized, anything that Tim might fact check, there's no real sense that it's real, in the same way that there's no sense that what JD is saying is real. It's all talking points from their specific perspective. And here the moderators have and should continue to have a responsibility to let the American people know what is fact and what is not fact. And the fact that fact checking was off the table was so frustrating for our political process, for the information that American voters are getting. I can also acknowledge that the VP debates don't do a ton in moving any sort of needle, but even with that being the case, I want to, as a voter, I want to know that I can participate, I can listen, and the information that I'm getting is real. But in this situation, everything that JD was saying was suspect. I mean, he claimed that former President Trump saved the Affordable Care Act. And it's like, what? John McCain voted it down, and we were just so scared that it was going to go away because Republicans were lining up to vote for it, and Trump was here to sign for it. And the only reason we still have it is because John McCain put his thumb down, not because Donald Trump saved it. And so now there's this who knows what sort of untruth that will reverberate into the electorate, because now there's this narrative that Donald Trump may have saved the Affordable Care Act. And it's nonsense. So I was very frustrated.
I think that there's serious danger, because even him saying I've never been for an abortion ban when he is, and he said that he is, and maybe he's not now, but I doubt that. Like, I think the American public is unusually aware of Project 2025 and they don't like it. And I think allowing these people to kind of like walk back and be like, what? I don't know. And like gaslight us and like pretend as though that isn't their agenda. Like we haven't all watched the training videos and we haven't all read it. Allowing them to just pretend like that's not what they would do, even though we all know that it is like, not only is it like not cute, it's also actually terrifying and dangerous.
Well, and I think you're naming something important to both of you, that like, because this debate felt very normal, it was almost harder to catch their lies. And we're used to political spin. So like JD Vance saying he's not he's not in favor of an abortion ban, but he is in favor of a federal minimum standard, which is for him 16 weeks, which is an abortion ban.
Yeah.
That is an abortion ban.
Mm-hmm.
So we're back to the sort of like coded political lies instead of outright political lies on some issues in this debate. Some issues were just, again, straight up lies. And the fact that we can have a whole swath of the country that believes these lies, this political spin is a both sides, right? Like a justifiable policy position when one side is literally arguing for, again, the dehumanization. We talk about this all the time, the dehumanization of certain parts of our society. And the other side is trying to fight against that and not necessarily fully humanize people, but at least like keep it from getting worse.
But also just like, we have to forget, like, their candidate is a monster.
Right.
I mean, I think his voters are caught up in a cult where they just don't believe, they're refusing to believe anything that's negative or that makes them feel like their, way of seeing the world is wrong. And so they've chosen to buy into this person basically. And no matter, I mean, it's just like, this is where I do think studying religion and studying cults is helpful, because it is very much like a cult. Like, it just is. Like, you have to have this is why Donald Trump has surrounded himself not by people who have the same policy positions or people who might help him think more critically about what he's trying to do or anything like that. He's surrounded himself with people who tell him what he wants to hear, people who are loyal. Loyalty is the primary attribute he's looking for in anybody he puts himself around. And when that becomes the determination for who you're going to work with and who you're going to hire, it's a recipe, right, for creating a cult. Broadly speaking, this is what we have created. And I think to Wesley's point about the responsibility of journalists, right? And this is that they failed in regards to actually holding these people accountable. They're arguing that you could have this debate and have follow-up conversations around what he said that was true versus what he said that was lies, with the fact checking and that the American public will get it. But the fact of the matter is they know that's not true, because they agree to these terrible terms of the debate because the ratings are going to be high and they can make more money. Right. And so when news gets wrapped up in capitalism and it becomes about economics, they're going to make the decision that's going to make the most money. Now, I want to make sure we at least spend a couple of minutes talking about some of those lies specifically before we move into a broader conversation around immigration, because he had lots of lies on immigration. So, and actually, I would say most of JD Vance's lies were framed in such a way where they were like, everything is an immigrant's fault, essentially, is what he's saying. Like, it was an immigrant's fault. So he suggested that 20 million illegal immigrants, or illegal aliens is the language he was using. What we know is that's actually probably twice as many as there actually are. He blamed housing on the fact that we have, lots of, in his mind, 20 million illegal immigrants, when in fact, all the economists say the housing shortage we have is more to do with the Wall Street speculators buying up lots of properties and inflating prices when interest rates were extremely low. He said the increase in drugs, in fentanyl especially, is because of illegal immigration. When we have data that says in 2021, 86.3% of convicted fentanyl drug traffickers were U.S. citizens, compared to just 9% involving undocumented immigrants. And that's according to a libertarian think tank, not a liberal think tank, right? Wages. He was like, oh, wages are suppressed because immigrants will work for less. When in fact, it's the opposite. Like having people that make jobs more competitive actually has increased wages, is what the economists actually say. And I think it's just those kinds of things that someone could easily fact check, as you said, Wesley, and point out the lies that he's suggesting and lies that he's making is what makes this debate frustrating. And last thing I'll say is I agree. It'd be nice if Tim Walz was the person doing this, but that amount of preparation to do that's unrealistic, I think, for anyone to think, okay, I have to prepare my talking points. I have to anticipate. You do need to anticipate what they're going to say and have some notes about what you might say as a counter argument. But because it's an hour and a half debate, you don't know what they're going to say. You know what I'm saying? It's wild, the amount of things that not only he said that are lies, and the ways in which, as a country, from a journalistic perspective, clearly don't care to hold these people accountable for lying. The last thing I want to say before we move into a conversation about immigration, because again, he blamed everything on immigration, was actually, you know what? I think I'm gonna wait. We're gonna wait and have this conversation after our interview because I think it fits better there. We were fortunate to be able to, I should say, Blair and I were fortunate to be able to interview one of my friends from the University of San Diego, Dr. Victor Carmona, who is an associate professor of theology and religious studies, a Roman Catholic scholar and theologian, who, as you will hear in this interview, has done a lot of work with respect to immigration, both in the national and international perspectives. It's a topic that's deeply personal to him. And we engage in a wide-ranging conversation around like really a progressive theological framing of what immigration should look like. How should we think about immigration theologically, right? I also want to let you all know that they were doing some work on Victor's house while he was recording. So from time to time, you may hear some random sounds. We've done our best to clean up the audio, but it's well worth listening to it, even though you'll hear a little bit of background noise. So we will go ahead and have that interview now, and we will check in with y'all after it's done. All right, everyone. We are excited to be joined by a friend of mine, Dr. Victor Carmona, who is the Associate Professor of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of San Diego. So, one of my old colleagues. Victor did his undergraduate work at Georgetown and his graduate work at the University of Notre Dame. And he came to USD in 2017. And I am happy to say I was an important part of making that happen because I made sure we could hire both you and Peter because I wanted to make sure we could hire two people. So definitely one of my better hires in the department. So I feel good about that in terms of my time there. So Victor, thanks for joining us today.
Happy to be with you today.
Well, Victor, as I told you, I wanted to invite you to be on the podcast because of our topic of conversation on immigration and how kind of everything that's happening right now with respect to the conversations because of the current political moment, the way it's come up in the presidential election, particularly as it relates to the situation in Springfield and Haitian immigrants, and just how immigration really has been framed as the central topic from the Trump campaign, quite honestly. And so, I think for me, one of the questions I want to discuss, or I guess get at, is the theological framework, how we might think about immigration from a Christian progressive perspective. But before we get into that, I'd love for you to share a bit about like how and why you began studying theology and decided to specifically to focus on immigration and borders.
So, I think I came into theology by accident in a way, and perhaps even openness. My intention when I was in college was actually to join the Foreign Service. I wanted to be a Foreign Service officer. That's why I went to the School of Foreign Service. And my last year in college, I took this course called Power and Justice in the International System. And really the question was, what kind of international issue are you interested in, and what philosophical framework would you use to address its ethical implications? And I chose immigration because I grew up here in the border, born here in San Diego, grew up in Mexicali. And immigration has been a part of my life ever since I was a kid. So I chose immigration. And then when it came time to the philosophical framework, to be blunt, none of them made sense to me. They seemed too abstract and too disconnected from reality as I experienced it. Until one of my professors, Professor Marlon McMurrow, an RSCJ sister, suggested Catholic social teaching. And I didn't know what that was. She almost freaked out. Um, so she taught me Catholic social teaching during office hours for a semester on the side, basically, and that ended up being my framework. And you know, the irony was that going through that process and those conversations got me interested in volunteering for the Catholic Church with doing work with migrants and refugees. And after that, the rest is history. I slowly got pulled into this line of work, and I think ministry, and I haven't looked back ever since. It's been quite an adventure.
Thank you, Victor. I think that's like a really excellent synopsis of kind of how these things are meaningful to you and why they're important to
Yeah.
you. I think just to kind of get right to some of the core what we want to do, maybe if you could share a little bit about why you think or why immigration is a theological issue. Like, why is it a theological issue? Why should it be a theological issue? Why is it something that Christians should care about?
Yeah. The irony is that when I first started studying theology in grad school, that was a big question. A lot of folks were not convinced that it's a theological issue. They felt that it was too pastoral. It was too grounded in the life of the church. And the irony is that for me, I think it's precisely for that reason that it's a theological issue. In Latin American theology, especially the liberation theology of Gustavo Gutierrez, there's this sense of theology being grounded in spirituality, being grounded in the real life experience of that people have of God in their lives, including through experiences like migration. So spirituality, the experience of God in daily life, gives rise to theological reflection. What is happening here? What's going on? How should I understand where God is, where God is not, where God is calling me to be and serve, and so on? And that theology that stems from the spirituality moves us to action. It moves us to act, and that's why I think migration is a deeply theological issue. Any Christian, I think, any person who dares identify as a follower of Christ, or at least as one who attempts to follow Christ, I think it behooves them to grapple with the questions that migration poses to our discipleship today. So it's a deeply theological issue, I think.
You're describing practical theology, right? It's a theology where we reflect, right? If
Yeah.
the things we believe don't work on the ground, then we have to reconsider them. And if the things
Yeah.
we're experiencing on the ground don't have a theology to explain them, then it's our duty to find it.
Yeah.
And so that's beautiful.
Yeah, I'm curious, Victor. Oh, yeah, like what are some of the questions that migration raises? Right, you're like immigration, migration, like force these questions. Like, what are some of those questions for you? Just maybe a couple or some of the most important
Yeah.
ones.
The ones that I've been grappling with the most in the last few years have been around relationship, and because of the question of relationship, around love. So one of my concerns and critiques is that, based on my own life experience, but then after reading much migration theory, it became evident to me that migration scholars increasingly identify and understand migration as a deeply relational reality, as a deeply relational act. It's embedded in our history, it's embedded in our economics, in our culture. It's an inherently relational act. And yet, as Christians, we tend not to think or understand migration, at least in the US context, we tend not to think of migration as inherently relational. So if migration is inherently relational, what does it have to do with love? Especially neighborly love. So this is where, for me, it's a big question from a theological standpoint.
Can you say more about what you mean by it being inherently relational? Because I think in the American context, we often hear rhetoric that immigration is like a choice that other people are making, right? That
Yeah.
it's in this rugged individualism.
Yeah.
If you're going to migrate, that's your choice, and then it's your responsibility to deal
There
with
you
it.
go.
So can you say a little bit more about what you mean by relational?
Yeah, and this is where I think sometimes wonder if U.S. Christianity, including Catholicism, in my the case of my faith tradition, if we've drank too much of the Kool-Aid. So
Yes. That's
you
basically
know,
all we talk about on this
yeah,
podcast.
I mean
Yeah.
it's ironic because for some folks this kind of critique is too countercultural, either in a liberal or a conservative approach, but regardless of how folks see it, what I mean by it being a deeply relational act is this: precisely because of the rugged individualism that I think really shapes much of our political culture, we tend to look at decision making in a vacuum, as it being driven by a monad, somebody who's fully, completely, utterly free from the influence of others and from influencing others. And we also tend to see decision making in an ahistorical way, like there's no historical context into anything. And what migration scholars find, and I concur with this take, is migrations cannot be studied and understood outside of the historical context in which they are embedded. So that, number one. And number two, beyond the past, and even in the current context, in the present, migrations can also not be understood aside from existing economic and even social relationships. So look into the past, for example. The migration history that the US shares with Mexico is very distinct than the migration history that the US shares with, let's say, Belgium. It's just different histories, for many reasons. So that's, one of the questions is always, should we be conceiving of migration systems and the question of who should be welcomed into this country? Should we consider that question aside from the historical context of the relationship between the country of origin and us? And that's a tricky question ethically. But then the other question, in terms of the social and economic relationships, think of it this way. Right now in the US, we have about 11 million undocumented immigrants. Of those 11 million undocumented immigrants, I think a bit over a third have arrived here over 10 to 15 years ago, and a good chunk even longer than that. So in that span of time, they've developed relationships, economic and social, with U.S. citizens. They've fallen in love. They've had children. Some of them came here because they had jobs waiting for them. So when we think even of undocumented immigration, we cannot think about undocumented immigration as if we could disentangle these existing relationships between the undocumented immigrants and our fellow Americans. Aquinas reminds us, right, Augustine, being in love is part of human nature. Falling in love is part of human nature. The state is powerful, but it's not so powerful that it can control who you fall in love with. I haven't met a single person so
No,
far
that is
who tells me, "Oh, I won't fall in love with her or him," if they don't have papers. No, that's not how it
yeah,
works.
and I think
Love is
actually,
borderless.
if you wouldn't mind sharing, I guess it's kind of up to you and how this matters to you personally, right? Like your own
Yeah,
personal experience in this, because I know we've talked about this and you've written about it, so I feel like you're more probably open to talking about it. But I know this
yeah.
matters to you personally.
Yeah, I mean, it's the experience of mixed status families. So in the U.S., there are hundreds of thousands of U.S. citizens who belong to families where a family member might be an undocumented immigrant and another family member might be a permanent resident, a green card holder. And in my case, what happened was, and look, at the time, this was really embarrassing, but I had been a quote unquote expert on U.S. and Mexican immigration policy for some years when this happened. But when my wife and I applied for her green card, for her status, our application was denied, and initially, and it was denied because we submitted the paperwork in the incorrect sequence. So she was threatened with being deported and then barred from entering the country for 10 years. Now, as a U.S. citizen, by birth, I was stunned because it had never hit me. Like I had never considered that as a U.S. citizen, I basically have to ask permission from the U.S. government to marry a foreigner, and I understand why that is the case, but still, I mean, to feel the power of the government over my life and my human flourishing in such a concrete way, it was a scary proposition. And not because, going back to the earlier question, not because I or my wife, now wife, decided to do this incorrectly. Of course, we didn't decide, to facing potential deportation for my wife. Of course not. I mean, the whole point of doing things was to do them correctly, and as we set out to do, and as we were told we were doing them. But our immigration system is so broken that even somebody like me, with the quote unquote expertise that I had at the time, was still trapped by a crazy, broken immigration system that limited our agency, our human agency, our ability to act. I remember I would go to grad school at Notre Dame, and I remember there was a time when I would leave in the morning, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure if my wife would be home when I got back. Like, she couldn't drive in the county next door, the county over. We couldn't travel back home here to San Diego to see family because of the way the border works. She couldn't go through checkpoints at airports until her case got resolved, which thankfully it did. But that year, and it was just 1 year for us, it was it was a scary experience. So that experience colors the way that I approach a lot of these issues, a lot of these questions. That experience also invited humility in me in terms of how I think about other immigrants, and how I approach this. And all of our experience started because I fell in love with her. A U.S. citizen by birth, fell in love with a Mexican citizen, and then it was years of navigating our crazy, broken immigration system. So that was a bit of a long answer.
Well, you are the lucky one. No. It's a
No,
great
good.
answer,
Yeah.
but you are the lucky one in that relationship. So I know we don't have to talk about that, but we know who
Yeah. Yeah.
we know who the
I
lucky one
am.
is. I'll let
I definitely am.
I'll
Yeah.
let Blair answer but you can go ahead and ask the next question.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing your story, because I think it really highlights that even when you're trying to do it the right way, that the system that we've created is so broken that even the most well-intentioned, the most educated, the most resourced people still have difficulty navigating it.
Yeah.
So part of what prompted this conversation this week was the rhetoric that's been going on around Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio. And I was struck by you reminding us that it's like all immigration happens within a historical context. And if you don't know the history of Haiti, I will make sure I include in the show notes. There's actually a really great, very short Planet Money episode about how the American and French governments just like drained money out of Haiti for generations because Haiti had a revolution and refused to be enslaved. And they're one of the poorest. They are the poorest nation in the world, mostly because of the activities of the French and the American governments. And so we have people coming from Haiti to the United States to try and make a living and send money back. Over $3 billion in remittances go from outside Haiti back to Haiti each year. So that country depends on people being able to immigrate to other places.
Yeah.
So I'm just like aware of that history, and also know that so many people are not, and make these assumptions about what is or is not good immigration or right immigration or correct immigration based on what they actually don't know. So
Mhm.
that was a long-winded way to get to. How are you experiencing some of this rhetoric that's happening in the current election cycle, and what do you think about what's been proposed, not just by the Trump Vance rhetoric, but
Mhm.
also by the Harris Waltz campaign and how they are approaching immigration? Just what are your thoughts as a scholar and from your own experience?
So how should let me put it to you this way. So number one, I'm thinking about this and looking at it with a degree of disappointment in the sense of a lack of political imagination and political vision.
Mm.
And also number two, with an
Ooh.
acknowledgement and just an awareness of the role that the border, and well, let me be more explicit, the US Mexico border plays
Mhm.
in the in the American political landscape. And I think we're seeing both of these playing out right now. So in the sense of a lack of political imagination, it's very interesting that both campaigns are actually proposing a similar approach to the border, to the U.S. Mexico border, and to a narrowing of the doorway of the path that we have at this point, somewhat opened to asylum seekers and refugees who are trying to find their way into California, the broader U.S. So you see this, for example, with the latest debate, which happened yesterday with the VP candidates, where the solution on the Democratic side is basically let's just sign the bill that the Senate had negotiated earlier this spring, a bill that Mr. Trump torpedoed, for his own political motives. What's
Mm.
interesting about that bill is that it's basically reflecting a bit of more of the same. Let's just increase the number of border patrol agents. Let's, what I do appreciate about that bill is, an openness to increasing the number of officers that interview asylum seekers and refugees, and also immigration judges, which we frankly desperately do need. But I'm saying lack of political imagination and vision because, and this connects to the second point, um, there's something about the American psyche where we're deadly afraid of Latin America. We're deadly afraid of people who look different than I think what people imagine an American ought to look like. We have a relationship with the U.S. Mexico border that we do not have with the U.S. Canadian border, even though the U.S. Canadian border, and its breakdown played a huge role during the terrorist attacks of 9/11. Um,
Yeah.
so part of my research, what I'm doing right now, is I'm trying to have a better understanding of the role that racism plays in all of this, and I think we're seeing some of that racism play out in what's happening in Ohio. Um, it is a part of our immigration, the history of our immigration policy. And I think it's something that it's at work in our immigration debate right now, but it's kind of like playing this back. It's playing a role in the background. People are not coming out and saying it outright, but I do think that there's a tinge of a very important tinge of racism that is playing out, especially around Ohio and the Haitian immigrants. You know, um, yeah, I mean, and there's other examples around that, at the border.
Yeah, I would say it's more than a tinge. It's more like
I agree with you.
Thank
I
you.
know like this
A
is
shout.
yeah, well, I mean, I think
Yeah.
you can be very diplomatic, and that's what I love about you, because I think one of the things that for listeners for you to know is, like, I think, Victor, what I appreciate about your work is I think you always try to speak to both sides of the
Yeah.
aisle. Like, you're
Yeah.
always trying to make sure you can be in conversation with people who are conservative
Yeah.
and people who are liberal, because for you it is about relationships, and that's the most important thing,
Yeah.
is solving the problem. Like, you have your own personal political feelings and philosophies, but beyond that, it's more important for you to solve this issue because it is a fundamentally
Right.
theological human dignity
Yeah.
is at stake with respect to the way you think about immigration. And I think that is it's really the only way we're gonna, I believe, solve the problem, because it's not it's being framed as a partisan issue, but it's not. Like, it really is. It's a
Right.
moral, it's a moral issue. It's a moral crisis, and we've made it political, but
Yeah.
it is deeply moral. How do you decide to treat people, right? Just fundamentally, without, people who have a state, but they don't have legal necessary right to be in your state. But what obligations do you have to them? Not only politically, but morally, because of why they're fleeing, and what processes do you put in place? I mean, this is, as you said, I do believe that race is at play, because
Yeah.
they want immigrants that look a certain way and don't want immigrants to look another way, out of, rhetoric, and mostly rooted in fear. Fear of the other, fear of brown people, fear of black people. They're taking their jobs, whatever. And even that, I think, is more. It's a particular kind of stereotype that they're coming to take your jobs, because they're, as they said, particularly in the case of Springfield, the jobs that the Haitian immigrants have are jobs that white that people don't want. Like, they're, it's not like they're jobs that people are trying to run down and get. They're jobs that functionally help our society run. And I think, for me, what I find frustrating and upsetting is that something that is not, um I mean, I guess Obama would say it's playing politics, when in fact, to me, it should be more about how can we begin to move towards a policy that actually is healing and restorative. Even because we have the evidence and data that says, if we create a plan and a practice and a process for people, it actually is better for our country. Like, we know this isn't
Yeah.
hard, but it's easier to persuade people, to convince them, that immigrants are a threat to our collective identity, rather than actually adding to the depth of who we are, and the breadth of who we are, to play to that fears of, economic anxiety or whatever, which underneath that has always been racism. I mean, that's why we had enslavement. That's why we had genocide. It's always been race. And so I'm wondering, and I know you had some data you were looking at earlier about people who were more supportive, I think, than you said you were expecting, of mass deportation.
Yeah. So, I mean, some weeks ago, I came across this survey from Ipsos that shows that. So the question was, to what extent do you support or oppose the following? And the question here is around mass deportation. So, do you support the mass deportation of undocumented immigrants? 54% of respondents said that they support it. 54. 54 support it, and 42% oppose it. I was stunned by the number. I honestly expected it to be lower than that. Now, granted, and to going to what you earlier said, Christopher, I don't know what the respondents had in mind when they were told mass deportations. I don't know what they were thinking, or what their understanding of history is. But 54%, that's a high number. That's more than half of respondents supporting undocumented immigrants. Deporting them. Look at of that 54%, 30% strongly support it. So 30% have strong
wow.
support of mass deportation. 24% somewhat support. On the opposite side, 23 strongly oppose mass deportation, and only 20% somewhat oppose. So I had two reactions when I came across this number. First reaction was, well, I the academic in me. Well, I'm curious what percentage of these respondents would self-identify as Christian. I just be really curious about that. As far as I know, that was not one of the markers or questions. But then my second reaction was, again, going back to a lack of historical awareness. I am a Mexican American. I am a third generation Mexican American, from, born here in San Diego and in the region. And in Mexican American history, there have been two mass deportations, include Operation Wetback, one of them. And a lot of U.S. citizens were deported as part of those mass deportations. So one of my reactions is, to the lack of historical awareness is fear. I also, thought of Japanese internment camps where the U.S. government, forcibly moved, thousands of Japanese and Japanese Americans during the Second World War and forced them into internment camps for the duration of the war. Again, many of them U.S. citizens. So when I hear mass deportations as a Mexican American, I'm thinking of my friends. I'm thinking of my family. One of my children, she's a Hoosier. She was born in South Bend, Indiana, but my youngest child asked me, could she be deported? And that's not a question you want to hear from your child. Can I be deported? Could we be deported? Now, I know that legally the answer would be, of course, not, mijita. We're citizens by birth. But history shows that practically, yes, we can. Especially if you look a certain way or speak English with a certain accent like mine. So that worries me. It's not an abstraction. So
No,
I
I think that's
yeah,
excellent answer. I think it gets back to the point you made earlier about relationality. Even the way you're
yeah,
describing it, I mean, we've had this conversation before, but every time you tell the story about you and your wife, and every time you talk about it, and you remind me of the fact that as people, the longer they're here, the relationships they have and they develop and they deepen, people become connected. They're reconnecting, and to move them is another kind of trauma, right? That
yeah,
they would be experiencing that should be inflicted on so many people. And so it
yeah.
is a question of compassion, I would argue as well. The last question I have, Victor, is really just about like, what would a progressive Christian theology of
Mhm.
immigration look like for you? And you have to call it progressive because I don't know how you want to frame it. What would a
Sometimes
good,
liberative.
yeah,
Sometimes we
a
use that word,
liberative,
right?
a
Progressive is the
liberative
political word
theology
that carries its
of,
own baggage, but like if we
exactly.
really take
Yeah.
seriously that we often talk about the full humanization of
Yep.
all people and the liberation from oppression as primary goals.
Give me
That's our when we talk about progressive, that's what we mean.
Yeah, so for me, it would look definitely compassion would be an important part of it. Um, it would look responsive. It would look at our reality from a perspective of hope and political imagination. So when I use the term politics, I mean politics in the context of Catholic social teaching, Catholic social thought. Politics is the pursuit of the common good for all in the community. And those who are part of the community, because of our relationality, include both citizens and non-citizens. So this idea out there that prioritizing the needs of our citizens vis-a-vis the needs of foreigners who are living in the country, that's a very narrow-minded way of looking at the challenge that we have in front of us. We need to be able to act and think about this in a way that is attentive to daily life, to the practicalities of being able to live in family in daily life, to the practicalities of being able to work in peace in daily life among people who are citizens and non-citizens alike, so that all could flourish. That's the kind of politics that I want to see. That's the kind of politics that I think Christians in this country are called to nurture. And if people think that that's unrealistic, then I don't know what crucified incarnate God they are following.
Now you're preaching. Come
I
on.
know. I told you, Blair. That's what I was
Come on.
saying. I was like, this is where I said like,
I'm ready.
Victor, if Victor was not Catholic, he would be a Protestant clergy person. Um,
Thank you.
Victor, I know you are busy. You're on sabbatical. You got stuff going on. You got stuff going on around your house, and so I don't want to keep you any longer. But I just want to thank you so much for being able to hop on short notice and participate and really just educate us and educate our audience about
Absolutely.
what we need to be thinking about, not only with this election, but the way we talk about immigration with a theological perspective. But your encouragement to expand our imaginations, I think, is just is critical in your argument for the humanization of all people. I mean, it's it's beautiful. So thank you for joining us, and I'm sure we'll have you on again.
Yes.
Maybe when things calm down a bit. And you have some other stuff you can talk about. So I know you're working on some projects we can't talk about, but we can actually start talking about some of the things you're doing and trying to put into action.
Wonderful. And thank you for the kind invitation. It was a pleasure to join you and your listeners.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Victor. We'll talk to you soon. All right, everyone. That was an amazing conversation. I was so fortunate to be able to get a hold of Victor and reach out to him, and he was able to really join us on fairly short notice, but he was excited to talk about something that's really important to him. And as y'all could hear, something he's deeply invested in from a personal perspective. So I'm really curious as to what y'all thought about some of the points he was making and just kind of what came up for you after you have thought more critically or thought more about the conversation we had a few days ago with Victor.
Totally. I mean, I think one of the first things that sparked me when y'all were talking at the beginning was he was talking about immigration as theological, and that he had heard or had been expressed to him that immigration was more pastoral than it was theological. And I wanted to get a sense of like what that meant. I'm in alignment with y'all in terms of like it's a theological reality or whatever, but like what is the Institute of Theology's pushback, or the Institute of like theology schools? Why would they push that towards pastoral and not have like an automatic theological framework for it?
I wonder, and Blair, I'm curious to your thought about this. I feel like that's more of a Roman Catholic perspective than it would be a Protestant perspective, because I think they see it as how might individual communities and priests, especially nuns, meet the needs of their respective congregants. And so, in that sense, it's pastoral because they're trying to actually be in and work with the community rather than developing this kind of comprehensive theological framework. Now, again, he has developed that and he's arguing for it, but he is, I won't say he's in the minority in terms of thinking theologically about migration. Within Roman Catholic perspective, I would say what he's arguing for will be considered progressive. And this is why I was careful with labels, because I know how he understands himself politically, but if he were here, I know he would say this is not a left-right issue. This is a human right issue. Like fundamentally, he was like, this is a human rights issue. And so he's always careful about how he frames it because he wants to pull more people together. But I think that's why that the current conversations are happening in Roman Catholic spaces. But yeah, that's my best guess. I don't know, Blair, what came up for you?
It's also a reflection of the standards in the theological academy that come out of Euro-American white perspectives, that we can have quote unquote theology that is detached, that is just theoretical, and that isn't necessarily of the people, right? Like theology is this thing we think about, and then pastoral theology is something we live. But we, sitting here as a group of Wesleyans, that's not how we do theology, right? John Wesley didn't do theology that way. His theology was always a practical divinity, he called it. And this idea that if you, and I think I, talked about this in the interview of like, if your theology doesn't work on the ground, then maybe we need to rethink it. And if you're experiencing something on the ground and we don't have theological language for it, then it deserves theological reflection. And that's not the historical way in which theology as an academic discipline is approached in the academy. And so that's like an internal theological academy kind of argument that we have with each other about what's quote unquote real theology.
I find that incredibly confusing. So you're saying that theology is meant to be considered and not practiced?
I mean, that is some people's perspective, or is like that the practices we have should be dictated only on what is the right way of thinking about theology. So philosophical theology is superior. What we do in the mind, what is logical, is more important than what is practical.
I don't understand that.
Well, because it's a broken aspect of like white men and their brains, where they never have to experience anything hard. and they
Yeah,
created a
yeah.
whole system of education around it.
I find that
And we've been trying to break it ever since.
incredibly confusing and nonsensical. That doesn't make any sense to me. But okay, great.
It still holds a lot of weight in the sort of high level academic theological circles.
Yeah, I mean, I think a prime
Yeesh.
example, like in my book, just how much pushback I got from my editor because of how much scripture I wanted to use. And I'm not a biblical studies person, but the Bible is important to me as a person of faith. It's very practical, even though it's technically a book on like theology and ethics. And so I named myself a practical theologian in the beginning of the book, but to help frame it. But it's not what we are doing, what I'm doing, what Blair is doing. Honestly, what I would say almost every Black woman I know in the academy is destabilizing this myth that these things are separate. To your point, Wesley, because that they're not. I mean, they're actively not separate. And
Well, if
it
they
is,
are, then what's the point of them?
I mean, the point is for people just to. Uh,
Like,
the
what would be
phrase I
the
want
point if they're separate?
Ruminate endlessly on
To
things.
think
that don't-
about
Well,
how
then
great
we
things
can-
could be, and like then
Yeah, we think about what could be right instead of working towards what should be right. And so
Yeah.
this is how we get a whole segment of Christians who are not concerned about the lived experience of humanity and creation on an everyday level. Because what is correct is this intellectual assent. It's right belief is more important than right action. And if you have your belief right, then you'll be rewarded in the afterlife. And therefore, what happens today doesn't matter.
It's
And that we're not
orthodoxy.
responsible for making today any better for anyone else. Because that's not the goal, quote unquote, the goal of Christianity.
but that only
And
works if you don't suffer.
Right.
Mhm.
You're right. It only works if you don't suffer. So I was going to say, anybody who's experienced any kind of oppression in any way, shape, or form looks at this idea of purely philosophical theology as being our guiding light and is like, that's dumb.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it only works for people of privilege.
I mean, I think it's orthodoxy over orthopraxy rather than try to combine or have an understanding of the two. I think, Blair, the point you made can allow us to shift a little bit more to dissecting some of the tangible things that Victor said, but also I want you to talk about the survey that you found, because I think it's an excellent example of how focusing on certain beliefs can detach us from the lived reality of people on the ground, even as people of faith, even as progressive people of faith. So, Blair, we're going to talk a little bit about that survey.
Wait, but before you do, can I just bring up one thing that he mentioned in the interview that really resonated with me, which is something that I think about a lot, and that is the idea of immigration inside of historical context,
Yes.
which is a thing that, because that now understanding that this thought catalog doesn't believe in it being in practical application, it makes more sense to me how and why things can be completely removed from reality, right?
Yep.
Whereas like to me, it's like, how can you not look at the history of Haiti and like take everything and connect that to what's going on in Springfield? Like like it doesn't, but it makes sense. If you don't think that it matters, then you would, as you were. Okay.
No,
Well,
you're
also-
totally right, Julia. Because it like allows people to abdicate themselves from relationality if they don't think about the history. And it makes them, it allows people to think this isn't my problem, or everyone's individual actions, they have to be responsible for their own individual actions. Like that only works if you don't think about yourself as being consistently related to other human beings. And if you don't think about the way in which historical context and the ways in which we've historically been related to each other and oppressed one another, the ways in which that's affecting our lives today, and that perhaps we do have responsibility for one another, even if we were not the individual perpetrators of injustice.
I mean, it's rooted in what we could call a historical amnesia, right? It is a collective forgetting of history, right, in the ways in which it actually took place, and then a retelling, a recasting of history in a way that allows those who actually participated in the harm, or those who were just complacent and allowed the harm to take place, to see themselves as heroes in the story. And so when you reframe the narrative in that way, that's how you can develop these theologies that are impractical, and make arguments around issues of immigration that are delinked from the lived experience of people, right? And so, to be clear, JD Vance, as we are talking about the arguments, or he and Trump, the arguments they're making about Springfield and what's happening in that city with Haitian immigrants, those are rooted deeply in racist logics, right? To be clear, because they're talking about Black immigrants. But they're also, in JD Vance's perspective, he's trying to make an argument from his Catholic theological perspective as well, right? He says, in his understanding, is that he thinks there's a moral framework from the Bible that says you're supposed to prioritize family above anything else, above all things. And to be clear, that's not true. Like, that's not
It's literally the theology the Nazis used. Like, it's
Yeah.
literally Nazi theology.
Yeah, it is not true. That is not in the Bible, but it sounds. I think when people hear it initially, they're like, "Oh, that kind of sounds right.
That
Like, I
feels
should
like
be
something that would
prioritizing."
be in the Bible. What?
Yeah,
Well, because it fits our current context, where like the nuclear family
Oh,
is
the
at the
idea, like
center,
the
and the
modern
individualism
Christianity.
is, yeah. Ugh. I didn't know he was Catholic, and now I'm even more disappointed.
But he's like newly Catholic, which is like a whole other thing that we can circle back to at a different point. But like, to your point about amnesia, I do agree that it's amnesia, but it's like selective amnesia, because if it were truly amnesia, like the grudges of
Mm,
the West towards Haiti wouldn't still be so effective, right? Like there's still resentment to Haiti, and it still is being played out, which is why people don't want Haitian immigrants in it, because that resentment still exists. So it's not full amnesia.
It's resentment, and it's also saviorism, right? So like the number of, if you just Google like Haiti Christian Mission, the number of organizations that exist just to send white American Christians to Haiti
yep,
to quote unquote save them,
of
when we
course.
created their system, like we white Americans, I should say, impoverished Haiti. And now we get to take these little mini vacations that are quote unquote saving them,
Yep.
which conversations around the economics of short-term mission is a whole other series of podcasts. But yeah, it's both resentment and pity, which allows particularly white Americans to continue to feel good. We can both critique and be superior to the Haitian experience at the same time.
Just makes me want to cuss.
yeah. Well, this is a I don't know what's the rating of the podcast does not allow us to say that. Although I will not name who has to get bleeped out, or we have to re-edit things. I will not name who is at fault typically when that happens.
Well, but so this is an okay transition, because I want to get this point in, because Victor raised this point that he recently had read a poll, and I found one from Axios that was reporting this similar data, right, where an increasing number of Americans support mass deportations of undocumented migrants, and these are high numbers. Republicans support, according to this Axios poll, Republicans support it at 68%. But Democrats supported at 42%. That's high. That's high for something that would be socially massively disruptive to the lives of millions of families in our neighborhood, right? Who is my neighbor? Like literally our neighbors, especially here in California. This would be massively disruptive to do a mass deportation movement, and almost a very high percentage, not quite 50%, but almost half of Democrats also support this. And what one of the questions that Victor asked was, it would be interesting to know both like sort of the racial ethnic makeup of those who are polled and the religious makeup. And so I found a Pew Research poll from this year, from March of 2024, it was reported on, that shows that if you are Christian, you are more likely to consider the situation at our southern border, a crisis than if you are a non-Christian. So when asking what do we consider immigration situations at the southern border. Is it a crisis, a major problem, a minor problem, or not a problem? US adults across the board said 45% of them said it was a crisis. But white evangelicals, 70% of them called it a crisis. White non evangelicals, so that's our mainline Protestant brethren, 57% called it a crisis. And the religiously unaffiliated, only 27% called it a crisis. So if you are Christian in the United States, you are more likely to consider immigration at the southern border an issue, a heavy issue, a crisis, than if you are not a Christian. And that is like a gut punch. As a practical theologian, as a person who cares about humanity and children in cages, like maybe they're responding and saying that's the crisis. Because to me, family separations and putting children in cages, that's the crisis. But yeah.
That was actually what I was curious about, is like if someone were to say it's a crisis, exactly what you just said. So Black Protestants, 32% consider it a crisis and 39% consider it a major problem. But again, like to me, I consider it a crisis because of how we're dealing with it. And I do think it's a major problem. I do think it's something that we need to figure out a humane way to allow people into our nation and like keep it pushing. We got to figure it out.
But it isn't even just allowing them in our nation. Like, we have people who have been here for decades who have not been able to get the
Right.
help they need to find permanent residency, to become citizens.
Right.
So, like, if I were to say that there is a crisis, it's that we've not really dealt
Figured it
with
out.
all of the people who are here because of inaction in Congress, because of lack of funding, because again, inaction in Congress, because we have presidents who malign immigrants left and right. And apparently we have 70% of white evangelicals who malign immigrants in similar ways. It's a crisis, but because we
Right.
continue to not see the humanity in these people,
Right.
and to provide solutions that make them whole.
Agreed.
I think what to me what's helpful about this survey, Blair, is that, like you said, you point out that, and while this doesn't break down along progressive versus conservative theological lines, we can kind of speculate with respect to, and so, for instance, Wesley don't have anything here about Latinx. They're just lumped into, I don't even know, whatever. But it is interesting that Black Protestants pretty much are in alignment with nuns and atheists in terms of their particular perspective on this, which I think says something, because Black Protestants are probably going to be the proxy to like a moderate kind of position, basically, is what I would say, because you definitely have conservatives and progressive, so we can just average out and say it's kind of a moderate perspective. But I think it speaks to a deeper reality that the way we have talked and thought theologically about immigration and migration within the church has been fundamentally flawed. It's been done in a way that's allowed us to abdicate or delink our relational responsibility towards our neighbors, right? Like not seeing them as, I won't say not necessarily seeing them as full human beings, but perhaps prioritizing the fact that they, quote unquote, broke a law and that somehow they should be held accountable or punished for that, rather than recognizing the circumstances that brought them here that were often created due to colonial policies, neocolonial policies of our own country, but also the fact that we haven't understood theologically that within the framework of Christianity, welcoming the stranger and welcoming the immigrant is like, that is foundational. Like that is exactly how like the what becomes the early Israelite community gets to be in Egypt, right? And then how they move out and are in the land of Canaan. Again, they're immigrants. Like they don't they haven't conquered any of this, right? They're just moving along as an immigrant group. And let alone you get to Jesus, who has to go to Egypt within the narrative that we tell, be an immigrant, right? Like
not just an immigrant, he was a refugee. He had to
refugee,
flee.
Right? Exactly. And so like it's woven into our theologies, and somehow we have lost the thread on how that should influence how we treat others. We've lost the thread on how that should inform our policies, right? And we're prioritizing the wrong things. We're prioritizing a fundamental misunderstanding of economic policy and economic anxiety that drives a lot of these things, and it informs our theology. And that, for me, I think was just sad, and it really has pushed me to think more about how we need to talk about this within not only the community that we all are worshiping, but just within progressive spaces. Like, how are we? Like, we can say, oh, we need to be and create policies to welcome immigrants, but we need to talk about why this is theologically sound, and then also articulate what those policies look like. I want to, Wesley, and I know I mentioned this to you before, and I want to make sure I give you the space to do this because you're the one person here who I think can speak to this within the four of us on a personal level, because your parents were immigrants. And we have talked about before how your parents aren't necessarily in the same kind of theological alignment as perhaps the four of us. But I'm
Totally.
curious as to how they are thinking about the politics of immigration and the ways in which it's being framed from the conservative Christians as like a fundamental problem, or that immigrants are the source of the problem,
Yeah.
the problems we have here.
Yeah, I mean, we're not necessarily. I think they were more fervent Christians growing up than they are now, and so that's, I think, a helpful cooling down of that reality. They're not progressive, I would say, but they're immigrants, they're low income, so they have a very different sort of perspective. They also know that Republicans are trash, and so they say that left and right. So they're never going to be moving in that direction or accepting those talking points, and they have personal experiences with the immigration system. My mom only became a citizen a couple years ago after being in the system for my entire life. And so they know the hardship of this broken system. They've experienced it. And we continue to be in mixed status families. And so in no way are these narratives sort of like seeping in and having them change their perspective. Right now, in terms of what they're talking about politics, we're celebrating all the positive moves that Mexico is making. Extending like a retirement benefits to Mexican citizens who are no longer in the country, like my mom, who live abroad, because they know that so much of the money that they've sent back to the country has provided for people in Mexico, and so as a result of wanting to make sure that people have what they need in retirement, they're moving into that space. Obviously, they just elected Claudia Sheinbaum as the first female president for Mexico. Like, there are moves and waves happening that are making Mexico a much better place for people to exist in, and we're celebrating that. And then we lament the fact that this country is so far away from those realities. So yeah, I mean, I don't think I think they're hearing these narratives about Haitian immigrants or other immigrants, and it's just very eye rolly. It's very like, this is nonsense. Like, we see in our own community the hard work, the commitment to this country, the desire to be here. They articulate the reasons why they fled their countries and lament the inability to be there, but also acknowledge all of the good that they've been able to have here. So yeah, I mean, these narratives exist, but my parents are definitely not buying into them, because of their lived experience in the past, but also currently. I mean, I think Victor talked about sort of how the immigration system in America lacks humanity, and that a positive movement forward would include compassion in the rulemaking or whatever. But I think the same way that like the system lacks humanity, but it's built by people. It's a frustrating reality to know that like we can change the system because people can change, but these these systems are so large that I think people don't think they can change them, or
Mm.
don't give themselves the permission from within it to start making these changes. And I don't know. I don't know what it's going to take to shift the perspective of the people who work in our immigration system. But it definitely feels very just like, oh, we can't do anything about it. Because I think what frustrated me about his experience of having to filling out paperwork incorrectly and having that derail the process was, it's like, oh, but filling out paperwork incorrectly is human. We don't always get all of the forms right, and there should be some amount of like, yeah, okay, cool, I know what you meant to do, let's just keep it pushing, and let's keep this process going. But it's so stringent that it breaks families left and right. Yeah, I mean, that he couldn't travel with his partner for years because they were scared. Yeah, that when my mom's father was passing in Mexico, she petitioned the court to let her go because she was in the process. She couldn't leave the country, and they said no. So, like, why would a judge seeing this, a child mourning the potential loss of the parent, and be like, nah, well, our immigration system won't allow it. That's a human being on the bench. Like, I don't understand the lack of humanity in so many of our processes. Um,
No, Wesley,
it's a
that's just
mess.
like, that is, man, I'm sorry. I mean, I'm really sorry for your mom. And honestly, that just makes me want to cry because it's so stupid.
Yep.
like you said, just a lack of humanity, that a rule that we made up, that, what I'm saying, like, we like, these aren't like, these were not
They're not
rules that
edicts
we,
from God.
yeah, exactly, they literally, we weren't on the mountain, and having God write it with God's finger on some stone tablets. These are just rules we've made up, and we are enforcing them in such ways that allow people to suffer like this, and it's so sad. It's so
And the
sad.
consequences are not minor. And I think that
Mm-mm.
this is something, again, experience changes your perspective on this, because when you love someone deeply who has gone through this process, or you have been exposed to what happens when you get that paperwork wrong, because it's not just, oh, we got the paperwork wrong, and if we travel and we get caught, then it's going to make it harder. No, we have a system of immigration detention in this country where we put people who made a paperwork error into max level security prison systems for a bureaucratic mistake,
Mm-hmm.
right? So when we talk about the lack of humanity like that, we are literally putting people into systems of punishment that are reserved for criminals who have committed murder. We're putting them in the same level of incarceration. And so that, like, when you learn that, when you see that, it does change your perspective. And I think that that is perhaps something we as Christians could do better, right? Is to not assume we know what it is to live in this system and this level of fear, and to take the time to be compassionate, to suffer with, to be in relationship with, to bear witness to what those consequences really look like for family separation, for mass deportation, for immigrant incarceration. Like, that is our work to do, so that we demand changes in policy and demand changes in operations. I think it really starts with helping those who have no understanding of what this actually is to start to engage with and witness and co-live with people what it is like to live in that system.
And it would be one thing if, like, once you became a citizen, you're good to go, like you're solid. But we saw under the Trump presidency that they were going after naturalized citizens, looking to see if they had made any mistakes in their paperwork to strip them of their citizenship. So that's a
It's so
very
easy to
real
lose your green
thing.
card.
That's going to that potent if Trump gets into the presidency, it's a very real thing that's probably going to come back. And even as we talk about like mass deportations, what I really liked about Victor is that he articulated like Japanese internment as mass deportation, that you didn't have to be sent back to a different country. You could have just been sort of jailed on an island in San Francisco for an indeterminate amount of time, and all of your belongings taken away from because they were left unattended. Like, that is mass deportation, and that is the power of the government. And so if we think that your citizenship is going to save you, it's not. So it's
Well, and that's like
Yeah.
a huge piece of it as well, right? Like when you talk about Japanese internment, like those are American. Like there's no these borders, these nation states, they're like made up. So, like any one of us who is a citizen of this nation by birth could, for any reason, just not be one day. And I think the inherent racism in our nation lends white people, they know that it will never be them.
mm-hmm,
So they don't think of it as a problem. Like when people
mm-hmm,
start talking about Haitians, I'm not Haitian. I'm American, but I know that somebody that nobody can look at me and tell the difference.
mm-hmm.
Well, history tells us that it never stops with
Right.
like black, yeah, it always
Right.
continues on. And so like,
Right.
anytime you start with black people, that means you're essentially going to get to Jewish people, and
It,
it's going to, because
a
racism and
thou-
anti-Semitism are
where
deeply
there's
tied
smoke,
together.
there's fire.
And
They're coming for you. They're coming for
yep,
me. If you don't like them,
yep.
I know you don't like me. Like,
Yeah. And like, and also the way in which they would start, then, I mean, this again, what I'm repeating is what has actually happened in the past, right? With respect to what happened in Eastern Europe, especially during pre-World War II. And you started having these very specific kind of ethnic identity classifications, right? And so this has happened in the past. So you can't, it would be unwise, foolish, one might say, to just assume that your citizenship or your whiteness is going to save you. Because when people start classifying, you don't know how things are going to break down. But more than anything, I think this speaks to the power of hate. And this is like hate. corrupts. Like, it doesn't stop. It doesn't have this kind of barrier to say, okay, I'm only going to hate this much or this person, and then I can stop it. Like, hate is an all-consuming type of energy, and it will consume you. And this is one of the things I love about Howard Thurman in his book Jesus and Disinherited. I want to say it's a chapter actually on hate, and he's talking to this white gentleman. So again, this is in the 1950s, and he talks about how he's speaking to this white gentleman in an era of segregation, and this man is saying, I'm teaching my children not to hate Black people because I know that if they hate Black people, they will ultimately end up hating themselves and more people, right? So like, this isn't, so some folks know this, some people have gotten this, and it speaks to just the power of that particular kind of emotion, and how it continues to corrupt and quite honestly inspire so much of what's happening in the Republican Party today. It is deeply, deeply troubling. I'm hoping that, and as I'm saying this, I know I want us to wrap up and be able to move to have a couple of thoughts as we close out. And I'm thinking now, I'm just going to say this so we hold ourselves accountable to it. Having another conversation or podcast, perhaps with Victor or Blair. I know there's even other people that Victor mentioned we can invite on to talk more about a constructive theology of immigration and what that looks like what we ought to be learning and be arguing for, because I feel like there's so much more for us to get into and unpack with this topic, given the ways in which it's been such a political foil during this campaign. But before we leave, both Julie and I have a couple of people we want to at least pour out some libations, as they say in our culture. And for me, I don't. For those of you who perhaps are familiar with sports, you or basketball, I should say, especially.
What an interesting way of saying. For those that are familiar with sports,
For the
as if it's like a niche topic.
it is in our community. It's actually
True.
fairly niche.
Absolutely.
Actually, like I have a few in our community. Like it's like art, more into art than sports. So for me, it feels rather niche, even though actually it's pretty popular.
Huge.
But
Huge.
Dikembe Mutombo passed away this week. NBA Hall of Famer, an immigrant from Democratic Republic of Congo. He died of brain cancer at 58 years old. He played for the Denver Nuggets. Actually, was the team he was on was the first team to upset. They were an 8 seed, and they upset the number 1 seed, Seattle Supersonics. And that was the first time that ever happened in NBA Finals or NBA playoffs. It was a huge deal. But the reason I wanted to shout him out is because, like, to me, he speaks to the power of what happens when you actually allow people to come to this country and to make the best of themselves, and how they end up both serving America and their home countries or the countries of their birth. And so he ended up helping develop Africa basketball, like the league, essentially, and helping develop like the continental associations that have raised the level of sport, not only for men, but also for women, which has been just a community and cohesive activity in these communities that are sometimes struggling because of the ways in which they have been carved up due to colonialism and the strife that's created. He's helped fund hospitals in his home country and just used this platform to do so much social good. And I was sad that, I mean, obviously sad when someone dies, but just when someone dies so young, I was surprised. Like, I was honestly just like shocked. He, was diagnosed with cancer just last year, but I mean, cancer, doesn't play. And for some people, depending on where it's at and what kind you have, obviously this is the end result. So shout out to Dikembe Mutombo, and really just hoping that he is resting at peace.
And shout out to Gavin Creel, Broadway leading man, who we lost very suddenly. I mean, not suddenly, but he was diagnosed with a rare form of cancer only a few months ago. And he was 48 years old. He was all over the Broadway. He was in, he's my favorite leading man since Thoroughly Modern Millie, but he like never said no to anything. He was in Waitress. He was in Book of Mormon. Like any lead role he could get his hands on, he took it and he played it. And he was in concerts and, all sorts of different benefits and cabarets. Like he just was so busy. And because of that, he was so well known, like beloved in the community. Everyone has pictures with Gavin. Everyone met Gavin. Everyone mourns Gavin. 48 years old.
One of my favorite renditions of "Take Me or Leave Me" is one that he did with Aaron Tveit for Miscast, and it's Yeah,
Yeah.
incredible.
So if you're not familiar with his work, have a look, because
It's worth
it's
it.
a big loss.
Okay, but also if we're talking about like this is not a memorial, but celebrating people, this week also was Jimmy Carter's 100th birthday.
Oh my gosh.
And so celebrating that, I
The
think
real
he-
deal.
the
Holding on for that election.
Yeah,
The
the man
real
who
deal.
has best represented what living your Christian values
Agree.
in politics can look like.
Agree.
We celebrate that he is still with us. He says he's waiting to cast his ballot for Vice President Harris. So we will pray that he makes it. And
can
we
do it.
celebrate him
You can do
this
it, Jimmy.
week too.
Oh my gosh. Wow. On that note, we want to thank you all for joining us on perhaps our longest episode ever, but honestly, I would say one of our most important episodes for the Progressive Christians podcast. If you would like to connect with us and be part of the conversation, you can find us on Instagram at The Progressive Christians and on TikTok, again, at The Progressive Christians. We want to invite you to rate, review, share, and subscribe to us on whatever podcast platform you are using. We are really trying to make sure that people have an opportunity to find us, and that is the best way for people to find progressive Christian political thought that can counteract the much more pervasive reality of conservative Christian thought that you can find in this sphere. So we really are encouraging you and hoping that you do that. So thanks for listening, and we will see y'all next time. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.